distributed tracing. So it's not just limited to a single process nor a single machine.
So this goes pretty deep. So what's the feedback from enterprise customers, or where you always have this concern about access to data, access to information, while you're doing some deep analysis and introspection of where your data is flowing in?
Yeah. So from a security perspective, or we have gotten those. We have gotten that question. We take, again, security very seriously. Everything's encrypted when it's sent to us. And we try and extract as much sensitive information from the data as possible and sort of sanitize it. But typically the people that have concerns like that and raise those questions aren't really our target customers to begin with. We have customers that do have dedicated hardware as well as in the cloud. But typically when somebody brings up that question, they're not ready to move to SaaS-based offerings.
You mentioned the space several times in your presentation. I mean, is the ability to correlate the data, is that your biggest value proposition, like in terms compared to the space, or is it the way you do monitoring? I mean,
I think it's a combination of the fact that we're doing distributed tracing. Mm-hmm. Again, the correlation of performance across layers, so that when you have a request that involves 5 different services across 10 machines or whatever, you can see a complete picture of it. So there's that, in addition to the fact that we are doing our pricing model is something that makes it easier. It makes it easier for businesses to deploy widely without being prohibitively expensive. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in terms of the deployment model, how is it deployed and how invasive it is, given that you're touching up and down the stack?
Right. So for each machine, you install a collector that actually does collect some machine-level metrics and whatnot. It also waits for messages from our instrumentation, which you install for each layer that you want visibility into. So we have an Apache module. We have Rails instrumentation. We have a PHP module, et cetera. And at that point, we also instrument any RPC protocols that might be in those layers to sort of continue the distributed trace. So it's basically install a collector, install instrumentation for the layers that you want visibility into, and you're good to go. So
if you're encouraging folks to do this as much as possible, how do you think about load in a runtime environment? How much overhead do you create for? So
each time that we collect a piece of data during a request, it's typically around just 100 microsecond overhead. It's sort of just like making a log call. Mm-hmm. In production deployments with the sampling rate set, I think that we measured it recently, and we found that it was just like an impact of 1% on performance.
So how are these guys typically in production? How often are they typically sampling?
And it could be anywhere from let's see, I think it ranges pretty widely, but anywhere between like 30% and below, 20-30% and below.
And then what do you do for the database?
For the database?
Yeah.
Meaning in terms of collecting information
that's
about
where a lot
SQL
of
calls?
the performance bottlenecks are in that.
Oh, yeah. So we can see SQL calls out to Cassandra. We have MongoDB instrumentation in beta as well. So we can see latency and also collect the queries and then fingerprint them. So you can actually see, for MySQL in general, a chart like that with a heat map, or you can just drill down to a particular query fingerprint and analyze performance like that.
Okay.
So who is using this service right now?
We have GitHub using our service. We just had Sprintly sign up actually over the weekend. This guy, Joe Stump, blew up his Twitter feed about us. I think he was a former engineering leader at Dig. Wistia has been a longtime customer as well as a few others that were sort of early on in the sales process.
Like when I mentioned at the beginning of the event, there are many different performance companies, but also monitoring different elements of a network. And do you envision yourself 3 years from now, 2 years now, to be the window, or do you feel like you're going to be integrated into, your data and what you're doing into other platforms?
I think that if I understand the question correctly, we sort of have a slogan internally, which is to trace everything. And that's sort of what we're focused on. And just like being able to have instrumentation for any component that people might use so that they can just install it, drop in, and get tracing. I think that the greater vision for the company is taking that tracing data and then providing a lot of, rather than just displaying data, making it easy to filter, which in and of itself has tremendous value, doing things like what we call, again, internally, science. So things that are more predictive, bringing insights about the data that we're collecting to the user that they would not otherwise be able to identify visually.
So how do you compare yourself to a New Relic, for example?
Well, difference is pricing model, of course, and the fact that we do distributed tracing as opposed to individual layers.
So it comes back to the collaboration of what you're doing between the layers.
Sorry, what?
It comes back to the collaboration.
Yes. Yeah. So you can see, rather than having to say, okay, I have my front-end application with a few different services, and having to look at each place when you want to track what went on in those services in a single request, we can show you that single request in one place. You don't have to hop around.
But typically, in large organizations, there is different folks are responsible for different tiers and different layers of that stack.
Mm-hmm.
Are you typically selling in organizations that it's like a one person dealing with the entire infrastructure in terms of setting it up and performance? And usually you have, what happens, you get these tools for each stack, or you get the New Relics for the job stack, and then you get, and then they, then there's always there's a pissing match between all the different folks, and that's why every startup wants to solve the pissing match. But the reality, people like having pissing matches, right? So it's
I think that typically we're talking to developers, operation engineers find us, and typically we end up selling to whoever operations reports to.
Okay.
So we sort of have the ability to see wider across the organization.
We probably have time for one more question out there. Anybody? Go ahead.
Sure. One thing that I often hear with the analytics space too, particularly with the case, you actually lose visibility into analytics when you need it most because if your instance goes down or something is really messed up, like what happened with back east, back last April. How do you handle that kind of stuff? That's a huge problem.
Could everybody hear that?
Yeah, so the question has to do with agent-based collection of performance data and visibility that you lose when an instance might go down.
Or if your instance is impeded, or if your neighbor is getting incredibly noisy, or things that are out of control or hard to control.
Right, I think that, so let's see. The way that our instrumentation works, if you reach, if you try and make a call out to a service where the instance or the agent has gone down and that instance isn't reporting data anymore, you will lose visibility into that one leg of the journey, but the rest of the requests, say, will still be intact. So you'll still gain information there. You'll just see sort of like this hole where that instance might have failed.
Okay, great.